Just a few months back, I decided it was finally time to sell my old car. It was a 2016 Honda Accord I'd owned for a couple of years, but since I recently leased a new vehicle, there was no reason to keep it around. I had originally purchased the Accord through an online classified site and paid a fair bit for it, so naturally, I wanted to recoup as much of that as possible. I listed the car for sale online at a price I thought was reasonable, maybe a little on the higher side, but still within what similar cars were going for. For the first few days, there wasn't much interest at all. The ad just sat there until, about 5 days in, I finally got a bite. The first person who messaged me offered me a ridiculously low price, which I politely declined. Not long after, I got a message from another guy. He introduced himself as Mark. He told me he was genuinely interested in the car and wanted to come take a look at it. We texted back and forth for a bit, and that's when he mentioned he worked odd shifts, long hours, late nights. The only time he could check out the car was close to midnight. He asked if we could meet around 11:30 p.m. the following evening. That immediately raised a red flag in my mind, but at the same time, I understood that not everyone works a typical 9 to 5. He emphasized that he was serious about buying and even mentioned he could pay cash on the spot if he liked the car. He threw out a slightly lower offer than my asking price, but it was still within the range I was willing to accept. After thinking it over for a few minutes, I agreed. I really wanted to sell the car and be done with it. I suggested we meet somewhere public, like a shopping center or gas station. Mark suggested the parking lot of a local retail complex that I was familiar with, about 10 minutes from my apartment. It seemed safe enough, and I figured worst case I could always drive away. Before heading out that night, I called my cousin, who lives nearby, and asked him to stay up just in case I needed a lift home after selling the car. He agreed. At around 11:20 p.m., I drove over to the shopping plaza. The place was practically deserted. It was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the occasional hum of distant traffic. A few dim streetlights illuminated scattered patches of the lot, but most of it was swallowed by shadows. I parked on the far east side of the lot, just like we had arranged, and sent Mark a quick text to let him know I was there. He replied almost immediately, saying he was running a bit behind because of work but would be there soon. As I waited, I sat in my car, keeping an eye on the empty lot around me. That's when something odd caught my attention. Lying on the ground about 30 or 40 feet away, near one of those large metal dumpsters, was what looked like a folded-up bill. I squinted, trying to make it out. I couldn't tell if it was a single or 100, but it definitely looked like money. At first, I considered getting out and walking over to grab it, but something about wandering around an empty parking lot that late made me hesitate. Instead, I slowly put the car in gear and rolled closer. As I approached, I realized it was a $100 bill, lying there as if waiting for someone to pick it up. But right as I was about to stop the car and get out, I noticed something else. A dark figure crouched low behind the dumpster. The person quickly ducked farther out of sight as soon as I spotted them. My stomach twisted. It felt wrong. The kind of wrong your instincts scream at you about. I drove past the dumpster a little, trying to angle my car so I could get a clearer view. But whoever was hiding there slipped behind the other side of the dumpster again, staying out of sight. At that point, every nerve in my body told me to leave, but part of me was still stuck thinking about the car sale. I parked a few spaces away and decided to call Mark. But then, as I was dialing his number, a cold, unsettling thought crossed my mind. I cracked my window open just a little. The parking lot was silent. As the phone rang, I heard the faintest sound, a ringtone, coming from behind the dumpster. The moment I heard it, I didn't hesitate. I slammed the car into gear and sped out of that lot, heart pounding, hands gripping the wheel tight. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road, heading straight home. A few minutes later, Mark texted me, asking where I had gone. I didn't bother replying. I blocked his number immediately. Looking back, it's terrifyingly obvious what was about to happen. That $100 bill might have been real or fake. Doesn't matter. It was bait, and whoever was lurking behind that dumpster wasn't there to talk about a car. I shudder to think what would have happened if I had stepped out of that vehicle. All I know is I'm beyond relieved I trusted my instincts, and that I got out of there in time. This happened just last autumn. At the time, I had recently moved into a rental house near campus for my first year of university. I was living with 3 other guys, and to be honest, our place looked pretty bare. We had the essentials: beds, desks, maybe a chair or two. But the living room was completely empty. No couch, no chairs, nothing. Since we were all students on a tight budget, we decided to check some online classifieds to see if we could score some cheap furniture. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, we just needed something to sit on, and odds were we'd probably toss it when we eventually moved out. After browsing for about 10 minutes, I came across a listing for a couch that looked perfect for what we needed. It wasn't new, but it looked comfortable enough, and best of all, the price was only $50. I showed the listing to my roommates, and we all agreed to go for it. I contacted the seller, who said he was across town but available whenever we wanted to pick it up. So later that evening, around 9 p.m., my roommate Evan and I hopped into my car and drove over to get the couch. It only took about 15 minutes to get there, but I remember the neighborhood feeling off. The area looked run down, with broken streetlights and overgrown yards. It wasn't exactly the type of place you'd want to hang around in after dark. The streets were empty, eerily quiet for that time of night. We pulled up to the address and got out of the car. The house itself looked as sketchy as the neighborhood. Peeling paint, overgrown lawn, that sort of thing. We walked up to the door and knocked. After a few moments, the door creaked open and a tall, lanky guy stood there. He had pale skin, messy blonde hair, and this strange, blank expression. He looked us up and down and asked why we were there. I explained we were there for the couch. Without saying much, he asked for $20, which confused me because the listing clearly said $50. But honestly, I wasn't about to argue with him if he wanted less money. I handed over the cash. The couch was already positioned right by the door, as if he had been ready for us. He pointed to it and silently walked away. Evan and I each grabbed an end, carried it outside, loaded it into my car, and got out of there. We didn't think much of it at the time, just figured it was an awkward exchange. But as we were driving back, Evan suddenly mentioned something that made my stomach drop. "We're being followed," he said, glancing at the rearview mirror. Sure enough, when I looked, I noticed a car trailing us at a distance, headlights glaring faintly in the dark. At first, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just another driver from the area heading the same direction. But Evan insisted that the car had been behind us ever since we left that neighborhood. We made it back to our street, and the car was still there, creeping along behind us. I wasn't too worried at that point. They hadn't done anything threatening. I figured maybe they lived nearby. I parked right in front of our house, and the other car stopped further down the street, maybe 100 feet back. It just idled there, engine running, headlights still on. Evan and I carried the couch inside and set it up in the living room. When I glanced out the front window a few minutes later, the same car had pulled right up to the curb, idling directly in front of our house now. We both stood at the window watching. Our blinds were wide open, and I was sure whoever was inside the car could see us, but we couldn't see them. We watched for what felt like forever, but probably only a minute or two. I finally decided to go outside and confront whoever it was. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the car suddenly peeled off, tires screeching as they sped away down the street. I stood there for a second, completely confused, before heading back inside. Evan and I talked about it for a bit, trying to figure out what that had been all about, but since nothing actually happened, we eventually just shrugged it off. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe not. For the next few days, everything seemed normal, but that didn't last long. One morning, another one of our roommates, Dylan, mentioned something unsettling. He had woken up early and happened to glance out his window. Our bedrooms were all on the second floor, and saw a man standing in our backyard. The guy wasn't facing the house, so Dylan couldn't see his face clearly, but he said it was weird enough to make him pause. Still, he ended up going back to sleep. The following night, all four of us were hanging out in the living room watching TV. The blinds were half closed, but through the gaps, I noticed movement outside. Two figures, both men, were walking across the front yard, heading toward the side of the house. I got up, peered out the window, and watched as they disappeared around the corner of the house, vanishing from sight. After that, for the next week or two, we kept noticing strange things. Random people walking through our yard, cars pulling up outside and idling, only to drive off after a few minutes. It wasn't constant, but it happened enough to leave us feeling paranoid. And then, it all just stopped. The weird visitors, the late-night cars, gone. Everything went back to normal, and we never had another incident like that again. To this day, we still have no idea what was really going on. But I've never bought furniture off sketchy online listings again. A few months back, I accidentally dropped my phone. Not just a little crack or scratch. The thing was completely shattered. The screen was destroyed, and it wouldn't even power on. It was beyond saving. The worst part was that phone wasn't just for scrolling social media. I relied on it for work, messages, everything. I knew I had to replace it, and fast. Rather than spending a fortune at the store, I figured I'd check online to see if I could snag a good deal. Maybe even get one the same day. I hopped on my laptop and started browsing through local listings. It barely took me 5 minutes to find what looked like the perfect replacement. It was the exact same model as my broken phone, supposedly in good working condition, unlocked, and listed at a really reasonable price. It was marked as used, but honestly, I didn't care as long as it worked. Since my phone was busted, a friend of mine was nice enough to lend me theirs for the day so I could contact the seller. I texted them, asking how soon I could come by to buy the phone. It took a little while for them to reply, but eventually they responded, saying they were at work and wouldn't be home until after 8 p.m. The earliest I could swing by was around 9 o'clock. It wasn't ideal, but still better than waiting for an online order to ship, and a lot cheaper than getting one from a store. I agreed. At around 8:30, I got another text. It was an address, and the seller simply wrote, "You can stop by now." I grabbed my keys and headed out. The place wasn't far, about a 15-minute drive across town. The neighborhood seemed quiet, filled with small, older houses packed close together. Not exactly sketchy, but there was something off. I double-checked the address from the text with the numbers on the house and parked along the curb. I got out of my car and walked up to the front steps. I knocked and waited. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. But then, I heard movement just inside the front door, and slowly, the door creaked open about a foot. I expected someone to greet me, maybe invite me in, but instead, no one appeared. I could hear footsteps moving away inside, but no words, no acknowledgement. I stood there for a second, unsure. Was I supposed to come in, or was this some weird mistake? I called out, "Hello," but again, nothing. Just as I was debating turning around, the front door slowly swung open a little wider. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The wooden floor beneath me creaked loudly with every step. The house felt old. The air was heavy, stale. Only a couple of small lamps were lit, casting weak, uneven light across the living room. In the distance, faint kitchen lights flickered from the back of the house. The living room itself was nearly empty. A worn-out couch, a couple of mismatched chairs. The place looked abandoned or barely lived in. Straight ahead was a hallway, and a staircase led to the upper floor. I hesitantly took another step in and called out again, "I'm here about the phone." Still no answer. And then I saw him. From behind the wall separating the hallway and the kitchen, a man stepped halfway into view. His grin stretched unnaturally wide across his face, revealing almost every tooth. His eyes were wide open, far too wide, wild, unblinking, like he hadn't slept in days. He held the phone out toward me in one hand, arm extended unnaturally straight. His other hand, slowly, deliberately pointed at me, and then, without saying a word, he beckoned me forward, curling his fingers in a slow, unsettling motion, all while that same maniacal grin stayed plastered across his face. My blood turned to ice. Every part of me screamed that something wasn't right. My gut twisted with fear. Without another second of hesitation, I spun around and bolted out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. I never found out what his intentions were, but I still get chills thinking about that grin. Safe to say, I'll never buy a phone off sketchy online listings again. A couple of years ago, I was in desperate need of a new TV. My old one had completely died on me, and to make things worse, I hadn't bothered to get a warranty. Instead of forking over a ton of cash at the store, I figured I'd try my luck with some secondhand deals. Craigslist seemed like my best bet. People there just wanted to get rid of stuff quickly, often for a bargain. After scrolling through listings for a while, I stumbled upon one that immediately caught my eye. It was a 55-inch flat screen, fairly new, and the price seemed just right. Low enough to be a good deal, but not so cheap that it screamed scam. I noticed the listing had only been posted recently, so I didn't waste any time. I contacted the seller right away, hoping I'd beat anyone else to it. The seller replied pretty quickly. His name was Tom, and I asked if I could come take a look at the TV that same day. I had the cash ready. As long as the TV worked, I was prepared to buy it. The only snag? I had no way to transport it. My car was way too small for something that size. Luckily, my friend Eric had a pickup truck, so I texted him to see if he could help me out. Meanwhile, Tom and I set up a time. He said I could come by around 3 p.m. to check out the TV. I figured Eric could meet me there with his truck, and it'd be an easy process. But when I checked my phone again, Eric still hadn't replied. Time was ticking, and I didn't want to lose the TV to someone else. So I decided to go take a look anyway. The place wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute drive from my apartment. The neighborhood was quiet. It wasn't run down or anything, but it was one of those semi-rural areas where the houses sat on bigger lots with more space between them, surrounded by trees. It felt a little isolated, but nothing too concerning. I parked along the street in front of the address Tom had given me. It was a nice-looking house, long driveway, neatly kept garden, a few decorations out front. Seemed completely normal. I texted Tom to let him know I had arrived, and he told me to just come up to the door. I got out, walked up the driveway, and knocked. A man answered. He looked to be in his mid-50s with graying hair and a short beard. He introduced himself as Tom. He explained that he was selling the TV because his son had recently gifted him a newer one, and he just wanted to get rid of this one. The TV was sitting right there in the living room. We turned it on together. It worked perfectly. I told him I wanted to buy it, but explained how I couldn't transport it without Eric's truck. I pulled out my phone to see if Eric had replied, and finally he had. but he wouldn't be able to help me until later that evening. I asked Tom if there was any chance he could hold the TV for me until around 8 p.m. Surprisingly, he agreed, but he made it clear he wouldn't hold it any longer than that. I thanked him and headed back home. When evening rolled around, Eric and I loaded up his truck and drove back to Tom's place to pick up the TV. But when we pulled into the neighborhood, everything felt off. The house looked different. All the lights were off. The garden decorations? Gone. Even the flowers from the front yard were missing. It looked like nobody lived there at all. Eric turned off the engine and started climbing out of the truck. I stopped him, telling him something didn't feel right. He paused, confused, but as he looked around, he agreed. It was unsettling. I tried calling Tom to let him know we were there. No answer. I texted him, nothing. We waited in the truck for about 15 minutes, but Tom never responded. The house stayed dark, completely silent. It was like the place had been abandoned. Frustrated and admittedly creeped out, we left. But that wasn't the end of it. Later that night, around 4 in the morning, my phone started ringing. Half asleep, I grabbed it. It was Tom. Curiosity got the better of me, so I answered. His voice came through the line, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. His words were slurred, muffled. Then suddenly he started laughing. Not a casual laugh. A loud, unsettling, unhinged laugh that only grew more intense, more manic, until he finally hung up. Took me a long time to fall back asleep that night. The next day, the whole thing nagged at me so much that I drove back to that neighborhood. I knocked on the door of Tom's house, but nobody answered. The place still looked completely deserted. Feeling uneasy, I walked across the street and knocked on a neighbor's door. When an older man answered, I asked if he knew who lived in the house. He looked at me and said flatly, "Nobody lives there right now. That place has been empty for weeks." Chills ran down my spine. I pulled out my phone to check the Craigslist listing. Gone. Completely deleted. I tried texting and calling Tom again, but now my number was blocked. To this day, I have no idea who that man really was, or what the hell was going on with that house. All I know is, I'll never use Craigslist for anything again. I live in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood, not completely isolated, but everyone around here has a decent bit of space. Most properties are a couple of acres, so you don't see your neighbors every time you step outside. It's just me and my wife living here. But at the time this happened, she was out of town on a trip with one of her friends. That afternoon, I had just finished mowing the lawn when I checked my phone and noticed a text from an unfamiliar number. The message said they were from Craigslist and wanted to know if they could come over. Here's the thing, I've never used Craigslist in my life. I was sure my wife hadn't either. Confused, I texted back, letting them know they had the wrong person and that I didn't use Craigslist. Not long after, they replied with my exact address. The message simply read, "This is your address, right?" My stomach dropped. I had no idea how they got that information, and I didn't know how to respond. I called my wife to ask if she had any clue what this could be about, but she was just as confused as I was. I figured it might be some kind of prank and decided not to respond to the number again, hoping that would be the end of it. A few hours passed, and I tried to put it out of my mind, until another text popped up. "So, can I come over or what?" That one sent chills down my spine. I responded firmly, "No, do not come over. I'm not selling anything." There was silence after that. I didn't hear from the number for the rest of the evening, at least not until around 10 p.m. That's when I got another text. "I'm here." My heart started racing. I immediately replied, "Who are you?" All they sent back was, "From Craigslist." At that point, I had to know if they were bluffing or if this person was actually outside. I got up from the couch and moved to the front window. It was dark outside, the kind of dark you get in quiet neighborhoods with no streetlights, but as I squinted out the window, I didn't see any cars in the driveway or on the road. Figuring it was just a sick joke, I sat back down in the family room, trying to shake it off. Barely 10 seconds later, my phone buzzed again. Check the front window. A cold wave of fear ran through me. I stood up and walked back to the living room. The moment I stepped in, I froze. Standing right outside the window was a man. He was staring straight at me, wide, unblinking eyes, an unsettling, almost deranged look on his face. I didn't recognize him at all. He stood there, completely still, just watching me through the glass. I grabbed my phone and called the police immediately. The man didn't move for what felt like forever, probably only a minute or two. Then suddenly, he spun around and sprinted off into the night. The cops showed up and searched the area, but whoever that guy was, he was long gone. I blocked the number after that. For the rest of the night, I checked the front window repeatedly, but he never came back. It's been months now, and I've never seen him again. But the question still haunts me. How did he get my address? Who was he? I still have no idea. Ironically, that whole incident made me swear off Craigslist for good. But not long ago, I broke that rule. I had recently moved just outside the city and finally bought my first car. Before that, I rode my bike everywhere, a really nice, expensive bike. But with the car, I didn't use it anymore. I decided to list it on Craigslist and see what I could get for it. The listing was up for a few days before anyone reached out. Eventually, a guy named Matt contacted me. He seemed interested and asked if he could come by that evening to check out the bike. I gave him my address and agreed to meet him in the driveway. Later that evening, I brought the bike outside and waited. A few minutes passed before an old, beat-up van turned the corner and parked in front of my house. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Matt. He looked rough, worn clothes, dirty hat, and right away, something about him made me uneasy. He looked over the bike for a minute or two, running his hand along the frame and squeezing one of the tires. "Tire seems low," he commented, then asked if I could grab my pump from the garage. Honestly, the tire felt fine to me, but I wasn't about to turn my back on this guy. He gave off a weird vibe, the kind of feeling where your gut tells you something's not right. I told him I didn't have a pump. Then, he asked if we could go into the garage because it looked like rain. It was a little overcast, but it definitely wasn't going to rain. Besides, the last thing I was doing was inviting some sketchy guy into my garage. I told him no, plain and simple. Without another word, Matt turned and walked back to his van. I wheeled the bike back up the driveway, but I noticed the van wasn't leaving. He just sat there, engine idling, watching the house. I took the bike around back, locked it up, and went inside. It took about half an hour before he finally drove off. The whole time, I kept an eye on him from the windows. The whole situation left me unsettled, but I tried to brush it off as just another Craigslist oddball. But the next morning, it got worse. I stepped outside to water the plants like I did every day, and there it was, the same van parked across the street. As soon as I spotted it, the van violently peeled out, screeching down the road before disappearing. I stood there frozen, my heart racing. I don't know what his intentions were that morning. Maybe he was watching me, maybe worse, but thankfully I haven't seen the van since. The bike? Yeah. I've decided to keep it. And as for Craigslist? Yeah. I'm officially done with that. Last summer, I decided it was finally time to replace my car. I'd been driving the same old, worn-down vehicle for the past 2 years, and when it started having issues, I took it to a mechanic, only to find out it needed major repairs. At that point, it just wasn't worth sinking more money into it. I sold the car for whatever I could get and luckily had some savings set aside for a replacement. I've always bought my cars secondhand, usually through private sellers online, and Craigslist had served me well in the past with finding good deals. This time, I was looking for something newer and more reliable. After a few days of browsing listings and borrowing my parents' spare car to get around, I finally came across one that looked promising. It was a 2011 Subaru Forester, listed at a fair price. Not so low that it screamed scam, but definitely a good deal. I noticed the listing had just gone up, so I knew I had to act fast. I messaged the seller right away, figuring there'd be plenty of others doing the same. The seller, a guy named Rick, responded fairly quickly. He said I could check out the car that evening after he got off work. We agreed to meet in a large grocery store parking lot near his place. Sounded reasonable enough. Around 8 p.m., Rick texted me, saying he'd be at the spot in about an hour. I drove over and arrived a few minutes early. The grocery store had already closed for the night, so the parking lot was completely deserted. Just rows of empty spaces stretching in every direction. I texted Rick to let him know I was there. He replied that he'd be pulling in within 5 minutes. Sure enough, a car soon turned into the lot, but it wasn't the Subaru Forester I was expecting. Instead, it was a plain white sedan, maybe a Ford or something similar. At first, I figured it was someone else entirely, until the car parked just a few spaces down from me and the driver got out, walking directly toward my car. The guy looked to be in his mid-20s. He approached with a friendly smile, reaching out his hand and introducing himself as Rick. I got out and shook his hand, still a bit confused. He asked if I wanted to see the car. I looked past him at the white sedan and raised an eyebrow. "I thought you were selling a Subaru Forester?" I asked. For a moment, Rick just stared at me, his smile flickering. Then he let out this awkward, nervous laugh. Sorry about that. I've got a few cars listed. Must have mixed up the appointments," he said, fumbling with his phone as he spoke. While he scrolled through his phone, something caught my eye and sent a chill through me. In the back seat of his car, a head slowly crept upward. I only caught a glimpse, just the top half of the person's head and their eyes, before they quickly ducked back down, out of sight. But it was clear, it wasn't a kid. It looked like a grown man hiding in the back seat. I tried to stay calm and asked Rick plainly, "Hey, who's in your back seat?" Without looking up from his phone, Rick replied casually, "No one. I came alone." I watched him closely as he kept scrolling, and then, almost as if to change the subject, he said, Yeah, I see it now. You messaged me about the Subaru, not the Ford. My mistake." I asked him if he was a dealer or something, but he shook his head. "Nah, I just happen to have a couple cars for sale right now." Everything about this guy was starting to feel off. The empty parking lot, the hidden person in the back seat, the weird excuses. It didn't sit right with me. Rick then asked if I wanted to look at the Ford Fusion anyway. He offered to cut me a great deal and even said I could take it for a test drive. But at this point, I was done. "No thanks," I told him firmly. "And I'm pretty sure I saw someone in your back seat." Rick walked back over to his car, opened the door, leaned inside, and pretended to check. He rolled down the passenger window and called out, "See? Nobody's there." Without another word, he started the car, pulled out of the space, and drove off into the dark, empty lot. I got back into my car and drove straight home. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling the whole encounter became. The hidden person, the convenient mix-up, the vanishing listing. It didn't feel like a coincidence. Later that night, I pulled up Craigslist to double-check the listing for the Subaru Forester. It was gone, deleted completely. The next day, I reported the interaction to Craigslist. I never heard anything back, but I couldn't stop thinking, what if it had been some kind of setup? A robbery? Something worse? And if Rick, or whatever his real name was, had multiple cars listed, how many other people did he plan to lure into a similar situation? I still don't know, but I haven't bought anything off Craigslist since. I've got a Craigslist horror story that I hope serves as a warning to anyone using sites like that. A couple of years back, I decided to sell my old laptop. It was a MacBook Pro, still in great condition and relatively new. I had recently upgraded for work, so I didn't need the old one anymore, and given how popular those laptops are, I knew I could get decent money for it. I listed it on Craigslist for $1,000. It sounded steep, but honestly, the laptop was worth even more, and I wasn't desperate to sell it fast. Within a day of posting the ad, I got a text from someone saying they were interested. I made it clear that the price was $1,000, cash only. I figured they might try to negotiate, but to my surprise, they agreed to the full amount right away. That should have been the first red flag, but I was just glad to have a serious buyer. Wanting to be cautious, I suggested we meet in a public place, definitely not giving out my home address. The buyer agreed and suggested a nearby Walmart parking lot. That seemed safe enough, well lit, plenty of people around, so I agreed. But then came the second red flag. They said they could only meet after 10 p.m. because they worked overnight shifts and couldn't do it any earlier. Sounded sketchy, but I figured that was possible. People work odd hours all the time. I asked for a name, and the guy told me his name was Chris. I introduced myself back, then asked what he looked like so I'd recognize him. He just said he was average height with dark hair. Not exactly helpful, but at least I had a general description. We set the meetup for 10:15 p.m. the next night at Walmart. The next evening, I drove to the store a little after 10. It was already quiet. Walmart was close to closing for the night, but I parked in the middle of the lot and texted Chris to let him know I was there. No reply. I waited, growing frustrated. Almost half an hour passed before he finally texted back, saying he was running late but would be there in 15 minutes. I debated leaving, but figured if he actually showed up and bought the laptop, it'd be worth the hassle. More time passed. It was a little after 11 by now, and I was about ready to leave when Chris finally texted me again. "I'm here. I'm at the back of the lot." I looked around, but from where I was parked, I couldn't see much of the back area. Wanting to wrap this up, I drove toward the far end of the parking lot. There were several random cars scattered around back there, most of them sitting empty. I couldn't tell which one, if any, was his. I parked off to the side and texted him again, asking exactly where he was. No reply, and then I saw a car approaching. At first, I assumed it was him, until it got closer. The driver was wearing a black ski mask. In the passenger seat, another person also wearing a ski mask, and in the back seat, a third person masked the same way. The car pulled into the space directly beside me. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I slammed my car into gear and drove off immediately. The masked car started following me at first, sticking close as I weaved through the parking lot. But when I reached the front of the store, I spotted a police car parked near the entrance. Without thinking, I drove straight for it. The car following me must have seen it too. They suddenly made a sharp U-turn, speeding off in the other direction, disappearing into the dark lot. When I got closer to the police car, I realized it was empty. But it didn't matter, the masked guys were gone. I didn't stick around. I drove straight home, blocked the number, and took my laptop listing off Craigslist that same night. I put it on eBay instead, and after that experience, I won't be using Craigslist for anything ever again. A few years ago, I finally decided it was time to get a new car, or at least something newer than what I was driving at the time. My old car was over 20 years old, and to say it was unreliable would be putting it mildly. It would break down at random, and honestly, I was pushing my luck every time I drove it. After saving up for a while, I started hunting for a used car that wouldn't leave me stranded on the side of the road. Craigslist had always been my go-to for these kinds of things. I'd bought my first car there years back and scored a decent deal, so I figured I'd try my luck again. I'd been browsing listings for about a month when I came across something that looked promising. It wasn't perfect, the mileage was a little high, but still better than what I had, and the price was hard to beat. I reached out to the seller and found out he wasn't a private owner. He ran a small dealership in town. He told me I could come check out the car the next day. When I pulled up to the lot, I immediately felt uneasy. The place looked off, run down, weathered, like time had forgotten it. The lot was small, the cracked pavement overgrown with weeds sprouting through the gaps. There were maybe 8 cars for sale, all older models that looked like they'd been sitting there a while. The building itself was small, 2 stories, with peeling paint and faded signage. It looked ancient. I walked up to the front door and tried to go inside, but it was locked. I knocked, and after a short wait, a man opened the door and introduced himself as Terry. He shook my hand, and right away, something about him made me uneasy. He had a thick mustache, wore a weathered baseball cap, and honestly, he fit the rundown aesthetic of the place a little too well. I told him which car I had come to see and pointed to it sitting just a few feet away. Terry nodded, looked it over briefly, and then said, "Let's go inside and get the paperwork." That threw me off. I hadn't agreed to buy the car yet. Maybe he meant test drive paperwork, or maybe he needed to grab the car details, but still, it felt strange. Reluctantly, I followed him back into the building. The inside was even creepier than the outside. A narrow hallway, a couple of doors, and an old wooden staircase leading upstairs. The place smelled musty, and the whole atmosphere screamed "Get out." Terry pointed to the stairs and told me the paperwork was upstairs. Against my better judgment, I followed him up the rickety steps. At the top was a tiny hallway with just 2 doors. Terry gestured to one of them. "It's in there," he said. I peeked inside and instantly regretted coming here. The room was completely empty. No desk, no paperwork, nothing but 4 walls, a window with iron bars bolted over it, and this lingering sense of dread. It didn't look like an office, it looked like a trap. I immediately made up an excuse. "Actually, I need to use the bathroom real quick," I said, trying to sound casual. Terry paused for a second, eyes narrowing before nodding. "It's downstairs. I'll show you," he finally replied. We went back down, and he led me to a small, dingy bathroom off the hallway. The place was filthy, but I didn't care. I was more focused on getting some space between me and him. As I stood inside, I could hear him, standing right outside the door. Not pacing, not moving, just standing there. I tried to keep calm, but the uneasiness boiled over into panic. I wasn't sticking around to see what this guy was planning. I cracked the door open slightly, and immediately bumped into Terry, who was standing directly on the other side. I slammed the door shut again, heart racing. Then, without thinking, I flung it open hard and fast, hitting him with the door and forcing him back a step. That gave me the window I needed. I bolted out of the bathroom, turned down the hallway, and sprinted straight for the exit. I could hear him shouting something behind me, but I didn't stop. I threw open the front door, dashed to my car, and took off. The whole way home, my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Later that night, I checked Craigslist. The car listing was gone. Out of curiosity, I tried searching for the dealership on Google Maps, but nothing showed up. No business name, no location. It was like it didn't exist. To this day, I have no idea what was really going on in that building, but I'm glad I trusted my gut and got out of there, and I've never gone back. About 2 years ago, my PlayStation 4 completely gave out on me. Being a broke high school senior at the time, I didn't exactly have the money to walk into a store and buy a new one. So I turned to Craigslist, hoping to score a good deal. After a couple of days of searching, I finally found a listing that caught my eye. The price was great, almost too good, honestly. But the pictures looked legit, and I figured I had to move fast before someone else grabbed it. I texted the seller right away, asking if the PlayStation was still available. Within minutes, they replied saying it was. I asked if I could come by it later that same day, and they told me to come by at 8 p.m. I was pumped. A new PS4 for cheap? I wasn't about to pass that up. Around 7:30, I left my house. The place was only about 15 minutes away, so I arrived a little early. But as soon as I pulled up to the address, my excitement quickly turned into hesitation. The house looked rough, like really rough. The front yard was completely overgrown with weeds, the driveway cracked and crumbling. One of the windows had wooden boards nailed over it, and the rest were covered by large, dirty blankets. You couldn't see inside at all. The neighborhood itself wasn't the worst, but it definitely wasn't great either. A few decent houses here and there, but this one stood out in all the wrong ways. I sat in my car for a minute, debating whether I should even bother. Finally, I texted the seller to let them know I was outside. They replied almost instantly, "It's inside. Just come in." That made me hesitate even more. It was starting to get dark, and the idea of walking into that rundown house alone felt wrong. But being 17, stubborn, and eager to get my hands on a PS4, I told myself I was just being paranoid. I got out of the car and walked toward the front door. As I approached, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The blanket covering one of the front windows shifted just barely, like someone had peeked out at me. I stopped for a second, but convinced myself it was nothing and kept going. I knocked on the door. No answer. Then, my phone buzzed again. "Just come in." Against my better judgment, I slowly opened the door. The first thing that hit me was the smell. A strong, old, musty odor that filled the air. The kind of smell that tells you nobody's been living there for a while. I looked around. All the lights were off. The house was dark, empty, dead silent. I called out, "Hello?" No response. A faint light flickered on from deeper inside the house. Not very bright, but enough to cast long shadows through the place. I stepped inside cautiously. That's when I noticed there wasn't a single piece of furniture anywhere. No couch, no tables, nothing. It looked abandoned, except for that faint light in the back. Something in my gut finally screamed loud enough to get through my stubbornness. It wasn't worth it. I turned to leave, grabbing the door handle, but that's when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from one of the back rooms. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I yanked the door open, slammed it behind me, and sprinted to my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out of that neighborhood without looking back. When I got home, my phone buzzed again. A text from the same number. It was filled with profanity, accusing me of wasting their time and calling me every name under the sun. I blocked the number immediately. After that, I gave up on Craigslist altogether and bought my PS4 from eBay instead. Best decision I ever made. A few years back, I had the not-so-bright idea to look for a TV on Craigslist. Back then, I used to browse Craigslist all the time, usually at work when things were slow. I'd scored a few good deals before, sometimes even found free stuff. You never really knew what you'd come across. But if you were careful, it usually worked out. One day, I spotted a listing for a TV that looked like a great deal. I'd been in the market for one, and this one checked all the boxes. Decent size, good condition, and the price wasn't so low that it screamed scam. Plus, the photos showed the TV set up in someone's house, which made it feel legit. I messaged the seller, asking if it was still available. Within the hour, I got a reply from a woman named Leah. She told me the TV was still for sale and gave me her address, saying I could come by the next evening to pick it up. I looked up the address. It was in a neighborhood only about 10 minutes away. Sounded convenient enough. The next day, I grabbed the cash and drove to the house. When I pulled up, the neighborhood looked fairly average, nothing fancy, but not exactly run down either. But the house itself, that was a different story. It looked rough. The yard was overgrown, patches of dead grass everywhere. The driveway was cracked and uneven. One of the front windows was completely boarded up, and the rest were covered with thick, dark blankets so you couldn't see inside. Part of me hesitated, but I told myself not to overthink it. I parked along the street and walked up to the door. It was around 7 p.m., still light out. When I knocked, the door opened almost immediately. A woman greeted me, about mid-30s, average height, dark hair. She introduced herself as Leah, same as in the messages, and smiled as she invited me inside. I stepped into the living room, and right away, something felt off. The house was practically empty, besides a few boxes stacked here and there. It looked like they were either moving in or moving out. Leah noticed me glancing around and apologized for the mess. I told her it was no problem. She then mentioned the TV was set up in the bedroom and told me to follow her down the hall. We reached the end of the hallway, and Leah opened the bedroom door, motioning for me to step inside. I did, but the moment I walked in, I realized there was no TV. The room was completely empty. Before I could even react, the door slammed shut behind me. It all happened so fast. I turned around and saw that Leah hadn't followed me in. She was still outside the room, and now the door was locked. I tried opening it, but it wouldn't budge. I knocked, asking Leah what was going on, but she didn't answer. For the next minute or two, I kept trying the handle and calling out, but it was obvious no one was going to respond. The room itself was small, bare. Not a single piece of furniture, nothing but empty walls and barred windows. Felt more like a holding cell than a bedroom. I pulled out my phone to call a friend, no signal. That's when I really started to panic. I banged on the door harder, yelling for help, but all I could hear was muffled talking coming from the other side. Leah's voice and a man's voice. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were definitely talking to each other. I tried the window next. It wouldn't open, sealed shut. Furious now, I started pounding on the door as hard as I could, hoping to break it down. Suddenly, I heard a man yell from down the hall, telling me to stop banging. I froze for a second, but quickly came up with another plan. I opened my phone, cranked the volume all the way up, and turned on the loudest, most obnoxious alarm I could find. I set the phone down at the far side of the room and positioned myself behind the door, waiting. It didn't take long. Within 30 seconds, I heard footsteps approaching. The door unlocked, opened, and a man stepped inside, heading straight for the source of the alarm. That was my chance. I darted out from behind the door and sprinted past him. He tried to grab me, but I slipped out of his reach. Down the hallway, I saw Leah standing there. She made a weak attempt to block my path, but I was moving too fast. I barreled past her, yanked the front door open. She grabbed at my arm, but I shook her off and I ran. The man was behind me now, both of them chasing after me as I sprinted for my car. Luckily, I still had my keys in my pocket. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there. It wasn't until I was halfway down the street that I realized I'd left my phone behind. I drove to the nearest gas station, went inside, and told the clerk what happened. They called the police. The officers met me there, and after I explained everything, we drove back to the house. But when we arrived, the place was empty. My phone was found tossed on the sidewalk, a block away, but the house itself, vacant. Turns out Leah and that man didn't actually live there. The house was being rented by someone else. No one knew who they were. The Craigslist listing, deleted. To this day, I don't know what their real plan was. Robbery? Something worse? I'll never know. But I do know one thing. That was the first and last time I ever used Craigslist. This happened about 5 years ago in the early spring. The snow had finally melted. The grass was starting to grow long again, and it was time to pull the old push mower out of the garage. The mower had been sitting and used for months, and when I wheeled it out, I wasn't surprised when it wouldn't start. I fiddled with it for a while, tried everything I could think of, but no luck. After some online research, I realized the thing was probably beyond saving. It was ancient anyway and had been giving me trouble for years. My yard isn't huge, so I didn't need anything fancy, just another basic push mower. Figuring I could find a decent used one for cheap, I started browsing Craigslist for deals in my area. It didn't take long to find what looked like the best option. A used mower for $100, which sounded reasonable to me. After a little consideration, I decided to contact the seller. I texted the number listed, and about an hour later, I got a response. The seller said if I wanted the mower, I could come by and pick it up the following night. The meetup time was a little later than I preferred, 8 p.m., but I agreed. The next evening, I grabbed some cash and drove my small SUV out to the address the seller had provided. It was a little farther than I'd expected. Took me nearly 20 minutes, but eventually, I found myself in a quiet residential neighborhood. Houses lined both sides of the street, all fairly average looking. I spotted the right address easily enough. The garage door was already open, and I parked my car along the curb. I texted the seller, letting them know I'd arrived. A minute later, I got the response, "Come on up." I got out, crossed the street, and walked up the driveway into the garage. Right away, something felt off. The garage wasn't well lit. Just a single dim bulb hanging in the center. The place was cluttered with the usual random junk you'd expect to find in a garage. Old tools, boxes, spare parts, but no lawnmower in sight. I took a few steps further inside and called out, "Hello? I'm here." No response. That's when I noticed something in the back corner of the garage. Another door partially open with a makeshift sign propped up next to it. A torn piece of cardboard with the word lawnmower scribbled on it in marker, along with an arrow pointing through the door. I hesitated for a second. The whole setup felt strange, but I shrugged it off and walked over. Through the doorway, I found a narrow hallway. It was dark, but I could see another door to the right and a staircase leading down, presumably to the basement. The arrow pointed straight down the stairs. For some reason, the seller kept the lawnmower in the basement. Weird, but not impossible, I figured. Still, as I started down those steps, every instinct in me started screaming that something wasn't right. The basement was unfinished, cold, and poorly lit. Barely any light at all. But one thing was certain. There was no lawnmower down there. I turned to head back upstairs, and that's when I heard it. The door at the top of the stairs quietly closing. It wasn't slammed, just eased shut, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I looked up the stairs. No one there, but whoever had closed the door had done it from the outside. A surge of dread hit me. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. As I neared the top, I heard another door shut somewhere beyond the garage, and footsteps. Someone else was in the house. I grabbed the door to the garage and tried to open it, locked. From the outside, I spun around and noticed the other door, cracked open, leading inside the house. I didn't have much choice. I slipped through the door and found myself in a narrow hallway that led into what looked like a living room. A sliding glass door stood on the far side, leading to a back patio. That's when I heard footsteps approaching fast. Without thinking, I raced for the sliding door, yanked it open, and slipped outside, shutting it behind me just as a man appeared from around the corner inside the house. I didn't get a good look at him, but I could see him moving towards me with urgency. I sprinted across the backyard, around the side of the house, and back to my car. Heart pounding, I jumped inside, fired up the engine, and peeled out of there. Once I was a safe distance away, I blocked the seller's number. I wanted nothing to do with that situation ever again. Later that night, I reported the experience through Craigslist. I decided it wasn't worth the risk. I went to a store and bought a new lawnmower instead. I haven't used Craigslist since, and after that night, I'm not sure I ever will.